So we're going to go on to our sixth storyteller of our evening or afternoon, depending on where you are. And this storyteller, when asked what food represents them, this storyteller said a prickly pear, or tuna in Spanish, because it's sweet and bright on the inside and sometimes sharp on the outside. Love it. Okay, let's bring up all of our joyful noise for our next storyteller, Rogelia Lily.
Hey, Rogelia.
It was a January morning, a day after my first major episode, about 10 years ago. I remember sitting in my living room in my bathrobe, pumping what I thought was the last of my milk, suffering my dried and cracked breasts, staring at the television aimlessly. And at my periphery was the baby in her little crib, sleeping indifferently. My husband was not home. He had to go back to work. His 2-week paternity leave was up, and we'd agreed that morning that I would call the midwives that I had been caring for me and explain to them what had happened the night before. And so I decided to call one of my midwives. I was unclear about the cause, but I knew that I needed help. And so I vaguely remember all of what she asked and said, but what I poignantly remember was hearing for the first time that I could have postpartum psychosis and that it was dangerous and that it could escalate and that I needed to get to the hospital right away. And so she called the ambulance. And the first responders came to my house quickly, and the impact was that they burst into my house as if it were on fire. The door flung open, and I remember just the rush of cold air. And I didn't have time to change, and my baby was strapped into the ambulance right away. And it was a frigid and overcast day, but I was taken out on a stretcher through my front door. And oddly enough, I felt like the protagonist from that novel, The Scarlet Letter, wearing this giant letter across my body. I was utterly exposed and ashamed. I could not see my neighbors, but somehow I imagined them peeking through their windows, watching the scene before them unfold, speculating. We got into the ambulance and drove to the community hospital, and the scene quickly changed. They put me in one of those patient waiting rooms. I remember the walls being really blank, and it felt like this timeless bubble, windowless. And my baby was still there with me in her car seat, right next, sleeping, and still felt out of reach. I knew that my husband had been called and that my brother had been called, and they were probably on their way, but yet they still felt so distant. There was noise and movement out of the door in the hospital, but it still felt like the scenes of a movie. The first person to interact with me was a social worker. And when she came in, something felt off. Oddly, she reminded me of an anachronistic schoolmaster. She was wearing dark colors, and I wasn't quite sure if she was actually there and if the episode from the previous night was still lingering. She looked down on me from her clipboard and was asking me these rote questions. Checking them off almost carelessly. I remember admitting to her towards the end of her inquiry that that I was afraid, struck by her, panic stricken by her energy and her colors. And she stared back at me blankly. There was no evidence of empathy. I don't remember giving her the approval of admitting myself to a psychiatric hospital. But by the time my family arrived, it had been decided. I felt as though my will and agency slipped through my hands like the sand in an hourglass. I was finally driven to the hospital, psychiatric hospital, at dusk that same day. And I felt calmer knowing that my family was processing behind the ambulance with my baby safely. I didn't know then that this second ride to the ambulance would lead me to the darkest night of my soul, because my baby was taken away from me. My newborn baby was taken away from me for a week. Yet my body clearly knew that I needed rest and reprieve. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Beautiful, Rogelia.
Thank you. Thank you.